I was standing behind the counter at the small diner I've been running for the past 10 years. It wasn't anything fancy, just a quiet little place where regulars came for a warm meal and a bit of conversation. The lunch rush had just ended, and I was wiping down the tables when I saw him. A boy, no older than 9 or 10, standing just inside the doorway. He looked nervous, like he didn't belong. His clothes were worn and too small, his shoes scuffed and barely holding together. But it was his eyes that caught my attention, wide and unsure, darting between the menu on the wall and the tables, like he wasn't sure what to do. "Hey there," I called out gently, careful not to startle him. "You hungry?" He nodded but didn't say a word. His small hands clutched the straps of his tattered backpack, and his eyes dropped to the floor. "Come on in," I said, gesturing toward a booth by the window. "Have a seat." He hesitated, then slowly shuffled over and slid into the seat. I could see the way he pressed himself into the corner, trying to take up as little space as possible. My heart ached for him. I didn't ask what he wanted. I could tell he was too shy to say. Instead, I went into the kitchen and prepared a plate. A bowl of chicken noodle soup, a grilled cheese sandwich, and a glass of milk. Simple but filling. When I set it down in front of him, he looked up at me with those big brown eyes, filled with gratitude he couldn't quite put into words. "You eat first," I said softly. "We'll talk later." He nodded and dug in, eating slowly at first, like he wasn't sure if it was okay, but as he went on, the hesitation faded, replaced by hunger. I sat back down behind the counter, giving him space, but I couldn't stop watching him. I wondered where he'd come from, what his story was. That's when I noticed the man sitting in the corner booth. I hadn't paid him much attention earlier. He'd come in during the lunch rush and ordered a simple coffee. He was dressed sharply, in a suit that probably cost more than my entire month's rent. But it wasn't his clothes that stood out. It was the way he was watching. He had been observing the boy and me, quietly, his expression unreadable. The boy finished his meal, wiping his mouth with his sleeve before glancing at me nervously. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I smiled. "You're welcome. What's your name?" "Ethan," he said, his voice trembling just a little. "Where are your parents, Ethan?" I asked gently. His eyes dropped again. "It's just me. My mom. She's gone." I felt my throat tighten. "And your dad?" He shook his head. "I don't know him. I've been just staying around." I didn't push him for more. He was too young to carry that kind of burden, and I wasn't going to make it worse. "You can come here any time, Ethan," I said. "You don't have to be hungry." He gave me a small, shy smile. "Thank you." As Ethan got up to leave, the man in the corner booth stood and walked over. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair and sharp eyes. He reached into his pocket and handed Ethan a crisp $50 bill. "Take this, kid," he said, his voice kind but firm. Ethan hesitated, looking at me as if for permission. I nodded, and he took it, mumbling a soft thank you before slipping out the door. I turned to the man, confused. "That was kind of you." He looked at me for a long moment, then smiled. "Kindness deserves kindness." I blinked. I was just helping a kid who needed it. He nodded, pulling out a business card and sliding it across the counter. "My name is David. I own a chain of restaurants across the state. I've been looking for someone like you. Someone who does the right thing, even when no one's watching. You have a good heart." I stared at him, unsure what to say. "I want to invest in your diner," he continued. "Expand it. Make it what you've always dreamed it could be. If you're interested, call me." Before I could respond, he gave me a nod and walked out, leaving me standing there with my mouth slightly open and his card in my hand. That night, I sat in my tiny apartment and stared at the card for hours, turning it over and over in my fingers. I thought about Ethan, about how scared and hungry he had looked, and how a single meal had made him smile. I thought about David and his offer, and about how maybe, just maybe, kindness could come full circle. The next morning, I picked up the phone and dialed the number on the card.